Please go ahead and unmute.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee, a Senior Fellow in Governance Studies and the Director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. And I'm excited that you decided to spend a little bit of time with us today as we take on this really important topic on how we're going to create some good jobs for vulnerable workers in the broadband sector. As you all know, closing the digital divide is one of the premier and prime policy proposals that I have out there. And this is the best time to have this conversation, particularly as America has a huge down payment to ensure that we have universal connectivity among all parties. And we've been working really closely, if you've been following our work, to ensure that broadband, in particular, the type of closure that we want to do among vulnerable populations, has created a pathway for sustainable and livable wage scale jobs. And we think in our research that it doesn't require a college degree in order to enter this marketplace. And so today's discussion is really a way for us to continue this dialogue. We're very gracious to a few folks as we formulated our perspective. First and foremost, we've been talking to all of you, many of you who are participating on this webinar today, and others who so humbly joined us for us to iron out our discussion. And more importantly, we're excited that we're going to begin this webinar with the acting president of the Markle Foundation, Beth Colbert, who is currently in that role. Her organization has been leading the Rework America Alliance, which is a unique partnership of civil rights organizations, nonprofits, private sector employers, labor unions, educators, and others who are interested in creating opportunities for millions of Americans who are vulnerable or in low-wage work. And so prior to that, Beth was honing her leadership skills as the acting director of the Office of Personnel Management under President Obama, and before that, she was at McKinsey. Before I introduce her, let me say what we always say at Brookings. We at Brookings know that the Markle Foundation provides generous support to our program and has helped us to make this work possible. In fact, we are one of the grantees in their program. And I'd like to reiterate that the scholarship that we actually have at Brookings is independent, and all the research questions and policy proposals have been formulated independently. So with that, I want to open up with some remarks from Beth, because I think this larger initiative of which Brookings is a part is significant to talk about. And then after that, I will introduce our panelists who are going to dive into the spectrum of how we begin to think about how we're going to leverage this down payment on America's broadband infrastructure and create the kinds of jobs where all people can participate. So with that, thank you for joining us. Be sure to send your questions to events@brookings.edu, and we look forward to this conversation. Beth, I'm gonna turn it over to you, and then I'll come on back.
Thanks so much, Nicole. It's delightful to be here with you and the rest of the terrific panelists today, and all of you joining in the audience. As Nicole said, I'm Beth Colbert, the acting president of the Markle Foundation, and I know this conversation about creating good jobs for vulnerable workers in the broadband sector will provide a lot of thought-provoking input for all of us. I want to thank everybody here who's joined, probably via their own broadband connection. The last few years have really illustrated how important broadband is for so many of us to do our jobs and participate in education, family, work, and civic life. And we'll hear today about how the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is expected to create up to 200,000 new jobs for broadband deployment, which brings with the potential for industry to engage in a broader group of workers and provide more equitable career opportunities. But that doesn't come without its challenges. And the challenge is recruiting for roles that people don't fully understand or don't understand whether their skills are really relevant for those opportunities. And so we have to find a way to address those challenges. And that's what we're going to talk about. By the way, these challenges aren't unique to the broadband sector. And so as we listen today, I think it's important for all of us to reflect on how can we take the lessons that our panelists will share and think about where else they can be applied. As Nicole mentioned, at the Markle Foundation, we've been focused on workforce issues for roughly the past 10 years, with a goal of helping people move out of low-wage roles into good jobs in our changing economy. We've particularly focused on people who have great capabilities and great potential and who built their skills through work and life experience. They might have some post-secondary education, but they don't hold a bachelor's degree. That's more than 60% of the people in the US workforce today. That means over 60% of people are automatically disqualified from a good job if that job includes a degree as a minimum requirement. So those are the things we're working to change. And it's important to note that this issue about degree requirements is particularly acute for Black and Latino workers, for whom four-year degree requirements automatically exclude over 75% of Black workers and over 80% of Latino workers. So at Markle, as we think about this challenge, we're working to address this in a number of multiple interconnected ways. First, as Nicole mentioned, through our work with the Rework America Alliance and the Rework America State Network. The Alliance is a partnership of civil rights organizations, including our colleagues from the National Urban League who are here today, UNIDOS, nonprofits like Goodwill and Rural LISC, private sector employers like Microsoft, Boeing, Workday, labor unions like the North American Building Trades and the AFL-CIO, educators and others, including McKinsey, who've been big supporters, the Atlanta Fed, and many others. Our goal is to work with organizations doing work in and across communities to help millions of workers move from low-wage roles into better jobs. And part of that is our collaboration with over 30 states in the District of Columbia and a nonpartisan Rework America State Network, helping those states share ideas about how they can innovate and make better things happen for the residents of their states. Another part of this work is developing a deeper understanding of the potential from the major federal investments in infrastructure, including broadband, and what is needed to translate this really once-in-a-generation opportunity into tangible opportunities for workers, especially those who've been underrepresented in the past. A part of this effort has been working with another great team at Brookings, Joseph Cohen and his team at Brookings Metro, with support from our friends at the Strata Education Network to really identify the scale of the opportunity presented by infrastructure investments. The report that Joseph and the Brookings Metro team produced highlighted there's more than 16 million workers nationally who are employed in infrastructure occupations. That's nearly 12% of the US workforce. And typically these jobs pay more than similar roles in other sectors. But still, there are workers who don't have access to those jobs. And in fact, many prospective workers don't even understand what the scope and breadth of those opportunities are. So part of our focus is to take that up research and say, what can we do to move forward on that? We did a deeper dive in infrastructure to really say, how can we make these workforce opportunities become real? And we worked with the National Association of State Energy Officers and the Enos Center for Transportation to produce a report on state strategies to advance job quality and build inclusive workforces and infrastructure. This report outlines actions that states need to take, including deepening collaborations across workforce and infrastructure agencies, using the flexibilities in the funding in these bills to actually commit some of that to workforce so they have the people that are needed to turn these infrastructure projects into reality, and embedding equitable workforce policies into procurement practices so that we can create a way for workers, particularly women, Black and Latino workers who've been excluded from higher paid roles in these sectors and haven't been able to access them, to capture this next wave of investment. Our work with Nicole and her team is really focused on supporting their deep dive in the broadband sector, which is a critical investment arena. This work is part of a broader Markle Foundation research consortium on technology policy and good jobs, which was formed to gain a better understanding of the issues and potential pathways forward to connect workers to good jobs. This consortium is looking at questions such as what systems and policies must be in place for new technologies to create good jobs, advance labor market equity, and ensure shared prosperity. What skills and competencies are needed to make sure that these technologies become engines of broad economic participation? And I think the lessons we'll hear about from the panel today about the broadband sector are a great way to start to look specifically at actions that can be taken, programs that are underway, and new opportunities to really move forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Nicole with a big thank you to her and her team and the folks who are here for the work we've done together, and an encouragement for all of you who are listening to please feed this fantastic panel your questions and really think about the actions that you can take in your industry, in your community, to move forward on some of these ideas so we can make the difference and have all these investments play out in a way that really delivers against their potential. Again, thanks to Nicole and everyone at Brookings, and delighted to hear the discussion that follows.
Thank you so much, Beth. We appreciate you and we appreciate this Markle Foundation initiative, particularly when we talk about these good jobs that I think all of us who have worked in this space for quite some time, it has a different meaning for everybody. Just share a quick story. I became really interested in this space after seeing many years ago. Listen, I write about it in my book. It's coming out in January. You all have to buy it. But years ago, I used to find folks with just a GED that could actually get network certification, A+ certification when I was in the Community Technology Center movement. It was more than 30 years ago when we saw that. So I believe that there's a promise to this. The key thing is understanding the landscape and how we're going to get there. So I can't be more excited about this panel. I'm going to ask Kevin and Ernie to join me on this. One, because I think that these are really smart people that we're going to be in conversation with. Two, because all of you have joined us and are going to give us questions. events@brookings.edu, or if you're tweeting, good broadband jobs is the hashtag on Twitter, good broadband jobs. So let me introduce our panel, and then we're going to jump right in for the remainder of our time before we go to Q&A. We're joined today by Ryan Luby. Ryan, just wave your hand with these, where we've got our Zoom etiquette, but you all are all over the place in terms of my introduction. Ryan is an associate partner at McKinsey & Company, a leader of the McKinsey Global Institute. Ryan leads MGI's applied research on macroeconomics in North America, and his recent work includes a dynamic view of economic sentiment via American Opportunity Survey with an eye towards understanding the impact on most vulnerable populations. He understands the landscape, and hopefully we'll hear a little bit more from him on what the state of play is today. We're also joined by my good friend, who I've known for quite some time at the Urban League. Kevin Lee is did I say that wrong, Kevin, again? Kevin Lai?
No, Kevin Lee, you got it.
Oh, okay, see, I'm an L-E, you're an L-Y, so I knew we were kinfolk. Is the Director of Special Populations for the Workforce Development Department at the National Urban League. In that role, he serves as a project lead and subject matter expert working with justice-involved youth, re-entry adults, and the long-term unemployed individuals. And he oversees the job training and employment program that also include urban re-entry jobs programs and the urban apprenticeship jobs program as well. And then last but not least, my new friend, Ernie Pacheco, is a rank and file worker at the Communication Workers Association, Local 9412. The CWA District 9 Environmental Programs Coordinator. He's the California Broadband Lead and a 25-year telecom splicing technician. He's also the lead organizer of District 9's campaign around labor, environmental justice, and most recently, ending the digital divide. He'll talk a little bit about the Broadband Brigade that CWA is also putting together that I thought was pertinent to this conversation. So first and foremost, thank you everybody for joining us. Ryan, I want to jump right to you because I think we need to do some landscaping on where we are when it comes to jobs in general. So I thought I would kick off with you just to give us some prospects. I mean, as it's been mentioned, we have this huge appropriation, and as part of the statute of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, there is a workforce requirement. So I'm curious to hear from you, what are those prospects, particularly in a space where we're dealing with a good portion of money out of NTIA, right? When it comes to billions of dollars allocated to either expanding or investing in new broadband networks. Who's going to do the work?
Thank you, Nicole. And I appreciate the warm words of introduction. Just to provide a little bit of orienting context for those listening, I serve clients along the construction value chain. So a set of federal, state, local clients that are both dispersing and then responsible for putting dollars out the door. And then I also work with developers, lenders, investors that are actually driving some of the construction as well. And then my final segment of work is with investors who are interested in taking advantage, being thoughtful about how to drive increases in productivity, increases in labor supply, and unlocking value. With that overarching context, I think that at the highest level, what I think we need to anchor on as a society, and in conversations at the financial press and elsewhere, they're really focused on sort of near-term resilience and uncertainty. Is there a recession? Isn't there a recession? When will there be a recession? Will there be a recession? I think we need to focus on the longer-term structural context informed by aging demographics and limited immigration. We're supply constrained from a labor perspective moving forward. It's a combination of aging, which I mentioned, core constraints on social infrastructure, physical, mental health care, child care, elder care, and limited immigration. So the supply side is constrained. And we've now just had a huge slug of demand come through, which isn't cyclical. You got public sector CapEx, which is coming through, and then you've got a bunch of private sector commitments, which feel a lot less cyclical than historical flows. If you look at sort of like a pre-2008 sense. When we take the slug of private sector CapEx that's flowing through, we estimate, and at the risk of arousing the interests of economists in the audience, when we look at the year of peak demand, peak job creation, we estimate about 70,000 jobs will be created along the construction value chain in the year of peak demand relative to momentum. And we include all the way upstream architects, designers through manufacturing, distribution, and then down to at the job site as well. But roughly 50% of that, 40% of that is at the job site. And then about 40% of it is manufacturing distribution, then 10% of it is engineering and design. It's a small absolute number in terms of engineering and design, but that can actually be quite bottlenecking. You can't actually kick off a project until it's architected and engineered. But I think that's the overarching context. What I would say is we're supply constrained moving forward. We've got a lot of jobs along the entire construction value chain, not just at job site that owners see and have the most visibility to. So this is a really multifaceted problem, which is going to call for, I think other panelists will speak to this, a diverse multi-stakeholder solution that isn't going to be one where we can just close our eyes and wait until it's over.
So I love what you're talking about. So in the last blog that we wrote about this, that's available on the Tech Tank blog site, we actually tried to figure out ways to align certain skill competencies with some of these industries that you're talking about, Ryan, that are not clearly defined, like engineering, software, architecture, et cetera. And, there are a lot of folks that are probably on this call know it's taking a long time to get a national classification of these jobs. And so in our recent piece, we had to think about what are some of the skills behind construction, manufacturing, customer service, cloud storage support, and how do you transfer that to a sector that, like you said, is a burgeoning sector with opportunities, but it's below the radar, right, when it comes to many people. So would love for you to hold that thought, because I think that idea of being supply constrained also has a lot to do with whether or not people in the marketplace know that these jobs also exist. Kevin, that leads me to you, right? Because you deal with populations that are not supply constrained, right? From a particular standpoint, they don't know the demand, they don't know the supply, and they're not often in demand, right? Because there's special populations for whatever reason who are out of the workplace. So speak to us a little bit about how you're addressing these issues in your role at the National Urban League, and more importantly, what you see as a way to sort of engage dislocated workers, workers without college degrees, ex-offenders, people with disabilities, intersectional qualities that people have to get plugged into these 70,000, below jobs, because as Ryan said, some of them may be slated for something else, but just curious of your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Dr. Turner-Lee. So my name is Kevin Lee. I serve as the Director of Special Populations at NUL. We work on the Urban Apprenticeship Jobs Program. And this program is a program where we have partnered, with the multicultural media and telecom and internet council in the broadband sector. We also work with the North American Building Trades Union and the construction industry, as well as with the Center for Energy Workforce Development in the clean energy space. I, also work on and lead our urban reentry jobs program. And that's where we work with some of our most vulnerable populations, some of our special populations that include the justice impacted, the formerly incarcerated, the reentry adjacent, and family members. And so we're very well versed in what it takes and what supportive services are needed to help overcome the barriers to employment entry and to career training. The National Urban League, we are a historic civil rights organization founded in 1910. We're headquartered in New York City, and I'm an Asian American, and my pronouns are he and him, but I consider myself as an ally, and as an ally who works really hard to become a better ally each day to support the mission of the National Urban League, which is to fight to stand side by side, and to support the civil rights leader who are working to help African Americans and other disadvantaged communities to achieve their highest human potential. And so that has to include social parity, economic self-reliance, power, and civil rights. And and I'll segue into just to why we're here today, which is removing the barrier of being able to access good jobs when you do not have a college degree is a huge win. And it's incredibly significant because we have arrived at a place in America where we are finally recognizing the significance of the high school diploma. Its cultural rite of passage from, I'm going to take everyone down memory lane, like in your senior year when you're going to prom, getting your high school diploma, being at the graduation ceremony where your mom and your dad and your grandparents and your guardian are there to celebrate with you. I remember my high school graduation more than I remember my college graduation. And after the ceremony, the family, you might be going out for lunch or dinner, there's balloons. I absolutely love it. And more importantly, I believe that when it comes to working with opportunity youth, and we define it from ages 16 to 24, but especially for your young adults who are ages 18, 19, 20, who have worked so hard to get their high school diploma, or if they didn't finish high school, worked so hard to get their GED or high set. They absolutely deserve a chance to enter into different pathways for adult life, where you can go to college, you can go to an HBCU, or you can be placed in a registered apprenticeship program. And in that registered apprenticeship program, similar to college, you're going to be mentored. You'll be taken under the wing of somebody who's a journeyman, who's experienced, who can train you, because you're at the stage of your life where you're learning, and that's okay. That's what we expect of our young people, of our young adults who are who are 18, 19, 20, 21, and the opportunities that are going to open up, I believe that they will be limitless in terms of just working with vulnerable populations and just preparing the future for good jobs and good opportunities.
Yeah. Kevin, I appreciate you saying that, because not often do we hear in the Beltway here in DC, the type of passion and conviction that you have, because you work closely with people who have the lived experiences of who we're talking about today. And I want people to sort of hear a couple of things that I've heard so far as I pivot to Ernie. One, we have these supply constraints, and Kevin sort of like alerted me to this idea, and we have this new revaluation of the high school diploma, right? Because in many respects, if you recall, historically, as a sociologist, we sort of devalued having a high school diploma for a really long time. And now we're finding opportunities for people to plug into the labor force at all entries. So that's a lot of what I think this conversation has to be about, because we're not going to be able to fill these jobs at the rate in which we're going. So Ernie, I'm coming to you. I know in your job, your role, you think a lot about these things. So I want to know two things to get us started about this Broadband Brigade that the union is really committed to. And if you recall from our piece, we really think that unions offer, not only an opportunity for impacted workers to have more sustainability and longer longevity in this marketplace, but they also allow for, I think, improved conditions when it comes to work. So just curious to hear a little bit more about the Broadband Brigade and what you're doing there in terms of closing the divide and getting people into these roles.
Sure. So I'll speak on the Broadband Brigade, which kind of envelops or is around our apprenticeship program and other training programs. I'll go into a little more detail on that, I think, later when you ask some other questions. And I also want to say the caveat that you made me sound pretty fancy when you were introducing me. I think the rule of whoever has the longest title is like the least important person in the room. So it's a little bit like that. I will be in my bucket truck working tomorrow, but I'm really glad to be here. So the Broadband Brigade is part of a national campaign by CWA. It's composed, it's a large group, over 100 of frontline broadband workers all across the country. Most of the members of the Broadband Brigade, like myself, have decades of working in the broadband industry. I have 25 years myself. And we are leading CWA's advocacy on addressing the digital divide and ensuring broadband for all. And we want to make sure that as this enormous amount of public funding to address this long-standing problem, as we build out these systems, that we do it right. Right now, the brigade's focus is heavily on state level advocacy. We're focused now on, probably everyone on this call knows that there's federal guidance for the BEAD program, for the BEAD monies that are coming out, but each state is developing its own plan for implementation. And so we're doing what we can to try to have our vision incorporated in these state level plans. For us, well, here in California, where I'm at, we have a long history of working with the legislature and the CPUC, and we're continuing to do that on this. But we also recognize that we have to work in coalition with other community partners. And so we've been doing a lot of reaching out to them to hear what are their priorities, what are their vision about this expansion. I was really resonating with a lot of what Kevin said. We haven't yet reached out to you, but I definitely want to follow up with you, Kevin, on some of this. So we want to hear what other people's visions and priorities are and share what ours is. Our two primary priorities around the expansion that's coming out of the BEAD, first of all, is we want future-proof fiber networks for all, no community being left behind. Secondly, we want some labor language attached to ensure that as we build out these systems, it's well-trained workers doing this work in good jobs. We're a union. We like people to have good jobs. On that first piece of no one being left behind, no community being left behind, we want to make sure, again, that these are future-proof and scalable. We know from experience that the only technology that does that is fiber. We know from our experience, there's a lot of analysis out there that talks about the digital divide, breaks down what the problems and tries to quantify some of the scope of it. So we know from that, but we also know from our daily work experience. We hear from community members. I won't call them customers because broadband, we believe, is a utility, should be regulated and treated as such. We hear from our community members, I don't have the bandwidth for my kid to do their distance learning, which was a huge problem during COVID. Or I don't have the bandwidth in my connection to work from home as I need to and keep my job. We also, so we're hearing it, daily from community members. We also, because we're the people that build and maintain the communication systems, we in essence know where the bodies are buried. We know what communities don't have connection. Whether it's a neighborhood or a group of neighborhoods, whether it's entire towns or string of towns. In California, which I think we're actually better than some other states, we have enormous areas where there's no connection, where people don't have access to what they need. So we're working to make sure that no one gets left behind and that everyone has a fiber connection end to end. On the second front, on labor standards or labor conditions, we want to, again, ensure that a well-trained workforce working in good jobs does this work. And we have this position in the context of where the industry is at today. The telecommunications industry is like a lot of other industries, maybe most. We've seen significant downward slides in work conditions. We've seen wage stagnation due to deregulation, due to outsourcing, rampant subcontracting. Union density in the industry has significantly decreased. And when that happens in an industry, it lowers all boats. It's just the way it works with unions and density in an industry. So we're trying to address those things. A serious part of the problem for us in this industry is that a lot of companies have done not only subcontracting, increase their subcontracting incredibly, but they're doing it in layers. So it's subcontractor, and low wages and lack of training is a huge problem in the industry. And as we try to organize these companies, it's very difficult because of the layering of the subcontracting and because of very aggressive anti-union tactics that are often employed. Additionally, part of why we're asking for labor standards is, not everyone might know this. There's no reason that everyone would, but there's significant safety risks for the worker and for the public in this work being done wrong. Our infrastructure is usually side by side with other utilities infrastructure. So I'm constantly up on a pole or down in an unventilated manhole doing work. And there are hazards, not just for the worker, but for the public when it's not done right. When I, as a union technician, started years ago, I was given weeks of training on safety protocols and how to use our safety equipment properly and how to make sure that I came home safe and that no members of the public got hurt. Besides the classes, I was mentored for months by more experienced technicians until I really understood how to do the job safely. And it's an ongoing education at high road employers. It's ongoing education with safety. Unfortunately, we don't see that in the low road employers. They cut costs, and training for them, safety training for them, can be something as simple as here's your climbing gaffs, don't fall off the pole, or grab the pole if you start to fall. Completely inadequate. There additionally, when we have low road contractors doing this work, it also affects service quality. When you install your lines, whether underground or overhead improperly, they tend not to last so long, or they tend to work in a degraded manner. And so we have to go out and either replace them, or we have to spend an inordinate amount of time and money to maintain and repair them, which degrades the entire network and which increases the cost of operating the network. So going to our 4 priorities that we're actually trying to get implemented in each safety plan, we're looking for 4 things primarily.
Now, Ernie,
yeah,
you going to tell me a little bit more about that a little later in terms of the safety thing? Because I got some questions percolating for you based on what you said, though.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we have binders. I can speak for an hour about the problems that we've seen and the harm done. Yeah.
So yeah. No, actually, I like what you're talking about. And one of the reasons why we really want to make sure, and people are listening, why union representation is important. One of the things we found out in our first paper, particularly for one of the participants, is that particularly among vulnerable populations, they don't have the type of union entry as we have seen in other industries. And so it's really important as we actually go through this process. And Beth and I were talking not too long ago about creating not only good jobs in terms of this down payment, but also creating pathways to good jobs and what that looks like for all populations where they have some type of sustainable pathway to go from here to there. Now, Ernie, I'm gonna bring you up on another panel about this fiber thing. I'm just gonna tell you, we ain't gonna have no money for workforce, so we put it all in fiber, but that's a whole nother story and a whole nother panel that you and I can talk about. But I wanna go back to Ryan, because I think we're starting to connect the dots, my friends, right? One, we have the supply shortage. Two, we have to figure out how we revalue a high school diploma. And I think what Ernie is really getting at, how we create working conditions that are sustainable and long-term and give workers protections, particularly in safety. I was talking to somebody the other day, they said, hey, if all the rural money is, if a lot of the BEAT money is going to rural, how are Black and brown people going to get there? How are they going to work in those jobs, right? We got to make sure whatever we do that we're protecting the workers that are actually taking on those jobs and giving them sustainable benefits. Ryan, when you hear this conversation as an economist, I mean, does it line up? Is it too large in terms of really meeting the supply constraint? Or is it driving a new conversation on how we make these jobs much more sustainable and much more valuable to the national economy?
Just like to offer one correction there to the question. I listen first as a human and then as an economist. Which
I know. I apologize for giving you that.
So, okay, I think about these in terms of sort of core sets of barriers first and then opportunities. And the conversation really has changed on both sets of barriers, but in a qualitative sense around the second set. So the first set of barriers is around the core social, what I think about as social infrastructure barriers. And these disproportionately, pre-pandemic, disproportionately impacted vulnerable populations. And those gaps have only widened despite income-based fiscal policy during the pandemic. And so these are ones that everyone knows: physical health care, mental health care, child care, elder care. These are really core constraints that disproportionately impact the ability of vulnerable populations to be present in the workforce, from sort of like a formal U3 versus U6 definition, being unemployed or actively looking for work, but also being present and engaged while at work, which directly affects productivity, income, wages, and ability to grow within organizations. The social infrastructure barriers have always been part of the conversation. I think what's changed of late has been conversation around solutions, around the skills-based and credentials-based artificial barriers in the job market. And so historically, I mean, we've had really strong, what I think about as artificial supply side constraints from the paper ceiling. And what's been most exciting, Nicole, you mentioned in your introduction, you're doing awesome work on this with Brookings. Beth, Markle Foundation, Reskilling America Alliance are just doing fantastic stuff, looking at skill-based proximity, transitions, thinking about sort of mobility, jobs that take you from origin to really that take vulnerable individuals to higher income, resilient, really meaningful pathways. And I think that's probably the most exciting dimension sort of through which the conversation has changed. The thing I would just offer is that there's a reason that we rely so heavily on credentials, and that's because it's easy. And it's like doing skill-based mapping, skill-based hiring. It's really difficult, and it's not the norm. And it requires both fantastic data, Nicole, which you, Markle, others are gathering, putting together. We do some of that at McKinsey as well. But then having a perspective and then integrating that into a very local ground game in historically sort of resistant to transformation sectors. So I think that's a little bit of the lay of the land, how the conversation is changing.
And Kevin, I want to go to you because this social infrastructure part, and then Ernie, I want to come back to you because I think there's another track that we're missing, which I've been so excited about hearing from CWA when you think about another part of the job force. When you think about that social infrastructure and how it matches to this hardscaping of opportunity, Kevin, I'm curious to see when it comes to skills, you've spoken a lot about the social infrastructure side in your earlier comments. How do we move people into the skill-based environment? Is it apprenticeships? Is it experiential learning? Is it, community college engagement? Help us think through how we make that leap, particularly in this sector.
So it's going to be all of the above because it's honestly will take a village. And the National Urban League is, we are very much invested in ecosystem building. And so our partnerships, while we have 92, 93 Urban League affiliates across the country in 36 states and DC, both nationally and locally, we build out ecosystems with HBCUs, community colleges, industry associations, and employers. And with the skills development, it's not going, we have to get away from this linear path, from, where from high school we go directly into college, and that's the holy grail, where and you hear from even like 4-year private universities say to their college applicants that sometimes it's good to take a gap year. So sometimes it's good to also to start your career early on and be able to go back to school. For me, it's almost a false choice sometimes whether go to college or go to work, and you can do one or the other. I think that what's important is that we create multiple pathways. And what Ryan was talking about, just regarding the credentials, we have our participants, they take pride in the credentials that they earn in the trades, their OSHA safety training credentials. And when I say that, I really want to illustrate this because the population that we work with, they will carry their credentials with them in their jacket as they go from job site to job site. Like, it's different from a college diploma, right? We would hang it up on the wall, but for the population that we work with, it's skills building. It's being able to stack those credentials and being able to take that back to their community, back to their families, back to employers, to show that they're ready, willing, and able to work. But underlying skills attainment and skills building is also the need for supportive services. And I think it's so important to get to, what Ryan was talking about, like the need for transportation funds, for childcare. When you're working with vulnerable individuals and their families, having that emergency fund that's not afforded to them, if that's afforded to maybe families who are more privileged, when your car breaks down. So I'll leave it there.
Well, and I like what you're talking about. And again, for those of you that are watching us, I've got a question coming in through Twitter that I'm going to ask. Got another question that I'm going to ask. Please send your questions to events@brookings.edu or tweet it to #GoodBroadbandJobs, because I'm looking and I will ask it. I mean, I think, listen, and Ernie, I want to bring you in. I think we're actually seeing, and I like what you're talking about, Kevin, in terms of multiple pathways, right? This is something that we're going to be putting out in our next stage of research. One pathway technically are people who don't even know anything about this industry, that need the basic digital literacy skills. For those of you who are listening, particularly if your state and locality, digital literacy is not just showing people how to turn on a computer and get an email address. There could also be taking some of that support and enveloping it in programs that we're talking about today. Then I think that there's this other space, which I think all of us has talked about, which are these stacked credentials or experiences that workers may have that can easily transition them into these skills-based jobs or apprenticeships, which I hope to get into before we go to Q&A. And then, Ernie, you said something earlier that sort of piqued my interest, which is dislocated workers, right? And Ryan sort of put it in my head. Pre-pandemic, there were a lot of people also laid off, right? How do we also think about how to bring those folks into the marketplace? Because I'll tell you, and Ernie, I want you to jump in on this. I'm worried that we're going to run out of time and money. We would be trying to still solve a lot of the fractures that we have in social infrastructure and work processes in general to get to a state where we can actually place people who right now are on the brink of poverty themselves just because they lost their job. Go to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We need to do both. We need to bring in disenfranchised workers that have some experience in the industry and develop new pathways for people to enter it. As for workers that have been on the sideline, a little bit of context. Since 2017, the top 4 telecoms in the US, AT&T, Verizon, Lumen, and Frontier have laid off more than 52,000 frontline workers. The majority of them technicians. So we have a huge pool of workers that want to come back to the industry if they can get good jobs in it, which that's the problem. We did a survey of our sideline workers, and the technician of our sideline technicians who have been off the payroll from 2017 to now, and 3/4 of them, 74%, actually said that they would like to re-enter the industry if they could get a good job. Emphasis on the good job. 16% responded that they did find other work in the industry and were working full time. 30% that they were currently underemployed in the industry. And what that data tells us, or told us, is that we have to figure out some tactics to re-engage with these sideline workers. And to do that, we're actually doing a couple things. CWA created a referral service to put employers in touch with our pool of workers that have experience in the industry. Any employers who are on this webinar, feel free to reach out to me. We'd love to work with you. Also, we are creating, and this will live within our apprenticeship program, a sort of a refresher course and a quick recertification program to bring back workers who have been out for a year or two and make sure that they have the most up-to-date skills in fiber optic technology, and to bring them back in.
Mm-hmm. And that leads me to, and look, I'm coming for you all for your questions. I promise. I just have 2 more questions I want to ask, and then I'm going to go to the Q&A for our distinguished panel here. We've talked about good jobs, Ryan. What's the wage of a good job? I just caught myself, right? I mean, a good job back then, I'm kind of thinking what Kevin talked about, for me, was McDonald's after high school when I was growing up, because if you didn't go to college and you stayed within our community, having a retail service job was a good job. It only paid at that time $6, $7 an hour. So what is a good job, Ryan, just from your perspective? And then I want to just last, Kevin, go to you. If Ernie wants to contribute just on the value of apprenticeships, and then I want to go to some of these questions.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. So I think part of what the pandemic has, in some sense, encouraged us to re-examine as a society is how we think about what a good job is. I think historically, it's probably been super focused on some multiplication of wages and hours, which is still important. Wages and hours are still table stakes, but I think the bargaining and sort of valuation space has expanded as a result of this collective re-examination. So I think there's a whole bunch of non-wage value prop around meaning, flexibility, alignment with management, and sort of like mission-driven purpose as well, which is something that I think infrastructure build out in the construction value chain can lean into. You think about it, being part of the broader mission of fueling equitable American growth. I think that's a really sort of exciting non-wage value prop to sort of lean into. I think the 2 other pieces, though, that I'd just be thoughtful about from how we think about sort of a good job. One of the big ones is mobility, and the ability to facilitate both economic and household mobility within income quintiles, between income quintiles, and the ability to really climb the economic ladder. The third piece related to mobility is a structural resilience. So part of what's exciting about the infrastructure package is that it's long-term, non-cyclical dollars that are flowing in. I think there's a question around sort of resilience, resistance to automation, and these kinds of things that we also think about. It's part of why the pivot to skills-based is important, both for employees as well. Is what employees will bring to market when current task finishes are their skills rather than a credential.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's a pathway, right? As opposed to how I originally started this conversation at Brookings, that this is like a matching service of some sort. We're matching people into existing verticals. Okay, listen, I got some good questions coming through. I asked for it, they coming, okay? So I want to actually pivot it to all of you. Actually, Ernie, I want to pivot this one to you first. Our friend Megan Doug and Adele at New America Chicago, the Chicago Community Trust, asked this question. How many positions are open for union members? What is the process? And why do people need to join the union, or do they do an apprenticeship first, look for a job? Like, what's this process for people? I think that's a really interesting question. Megan, you had a lot of points there. We don't have a lot of time. So why don't we stick with that one in terms of, is it a linear flow where we should be looking at the codification of good jobs from, training to union, or is there apprenticeship to union? Would love some clarity on that. And then I have a question for you, Kevin.
Sure. So, I mean, there's different models, but generally, and to engage in our apprenticeship program, you have to be employed because our agreement is with the employer. It's a joint apprenticeship program. So as the employers ramp up their hiring, if they're working with us, that's where people will be able to get join the apprenticeship and have a job. Our apprenticeship is shaped as a 3-year course. If you have experience, you can come in and get credit for over a year of that, but it's usually you're a journeyman at the end of 3 years. But yeah, so to officially participate in our apprenticeship program, you have to actually have a job with the employer.
So you got to have a pathway, your pathway. So that's interesting, right? Because that means that we've got to figure out ways, and Kevin, it sort of pivots to you. I think a lot of what we talked about, and I think Ryan hit the nail on the head, the social infrastructure is not there, and potentially sort of the expectation infrastructure and where people land, which is, Kevin, your point. So registered apprenticeships, and this is coming from our friend Dan Hendricks, who we know out there in Colorado is working on this. They are ready to take people. How do we change the misperception and misconception that registered apprenticeships aren't for impacted communities? How do we make sure that history is over? Same way we're talking about unions, Kevin, we got to make sure people know a registered apprenticeship is not something that's going to keep you in school, quote unquote, but it's going to actually help you with that pathway. So
the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies recently released a report that was very sobering. It was on Black apprenticeships. And here are the findings. Black apprentices are underrepresented. They're only making up only 9% of all registered apprentices. Meanwhile, the larger workforce, it's 12.3%. So that means we need more on-ramps, such as pre-apprenticeships and preparatory training, as well as supportive services. Black apprentices are least likely to complete programs. So there's the completion challenge that we are trying to address, and that is tied in with workplace culture and workplace support and mentorship, because it's not your first day on the job. It's the paycheck after paycheck and the month after month and the year after year. And Black apprentices also they're the lowest earners amongst their peer groups compared to other racial and ethnic groups. This gives us a lot of concerns, but it also gives us our call to action, because I know, while yes, we are ready, but we have to get to what those gaps are, and we have to be able to identify what all the challenges are that stops someone who's vulnerable, who's considered special populations, from being able to start, to progress, to finish, and to be successful for the long term.
Yeah, no, that's a sobering fact. And I mean, I used to work at the Joint Center, so good always that they do incredible work when it comes to our communities. But to Dan's point, there are so many vacancies in registered apprenticeship programs, and yet we still have to create this match, because there is a progression, right, that can get you to a space of the type of social and economic mobility that Ryan spoke about. My friend here on Twitter, Homies Empowerment, if you're listening, I got your question. He wrote, in Oakland and beyond, how will we support undocumented workers and workers who feel overwhelmed by not feeling qualified? And Homies Empowerment is a grassroots organization. Anybody want to comment on that? Because I think that's actually going to be another area where we'll have to think about how do we get some of those workers out there. And it all depends, again, on, like I think Ryan said, how we address the immigration problem as well, unfortunately. Any questions on that?
Well, I'll say so, in kind of piggybacking on Kevin's point about pre-apprenticeship programs. If you don't have a job with the employer, you can't enter the apprenticeship program, but there is a pathway towards that, which is wraparound services, which CWA is committed to providing, and working with local community institutions that can help walk people into the process, get them some soft skills, get them the wraparound services so that they can feel empowered and have some backup as they try to get that job and join the apprenticeship service proper.
Perfect. I have another question. This is coming from, and I had her name, I had the name, John Rostam, from Miller Capital Strategies Respectability Project, I think. How can we better serve job seekers with disabilities? They're also impacted populations, vulnerable populations. Anybody in terms of people with disabilities?
This is just a case where I would just be really thoughtful about the set of social infrastructure barriers that hit any any existing vulnerable population. But then I think there are going to be an entire other set that additional incremental barriers in terms of access to broadband being one, access to participate in the workplace, that we just need to be thoughtful about with any population that's going to be differentially impacted. There are a set of, and I use social infrastructure like intentionally and kind of inclusively to try to expand the scope of solution beyond like bridge and tunnel, but it also goes beyond like beyond childcare, healthcare, physical healthcare, mental health care. It also goes to, Nicole, your point around the culture and expectations. I mean, there's all this wraparound culture that I think at each stage along the way, we're going to see vulnerable populations impacted, and we need to be really thoughtful as employees, as employers, as job seekers, as implementing agencies about how those constraints bite.
Right. Anybody else? Because I have a comment. I think, to this person's question, I think part of what we try to do in our research at Brookings is to think about the plethora of jobs that are available that, given the right classification under this sector, would allow us to actually bring in all types of workers. You don't have to climb a ladder if you're doing customer service or cloud storage support. You don't have to necessarily have, the agility and skills of a person who has other mobility, facilities is what I want to say, because there are some jobs that do not require that. And we've come so far, my friends, when it comes to closing the digital divide and accessibility. So I'm really sensitive to that question because we often forget that people with disabilities need to be part of this marketplace, because we have, just like women, and I can say that because I'm the only woman on this panel intentionally because I couldn't have more than 4, according to our event manager. But part of it is we also have to make sure women are engaged, right? And people can't do these jobs if they don't have people who look like them and have those experiences. I want to kind of say this. I know we have a lot of questions. I'm so sorry I couldn't get to all of them. Thank you, Lori Dallin, for your note about you can't be what you can't see, right? And that has a lot of implications based on the statement I just made. But I do want to say to all of you just one thing in the last 2 minutes. This is a time-specific period. This money is not going to be here for a long time, as well as these jobs. So I'd just like for you to close just really quickly before I get in trouble, because we got 2 minutes. How are we going to change the narrative from those that are impacted, where it's going to be like a Martin Luther King thing? Why can't they wait and give them all these skills and stuff like that? And meanwhile, they wake up and those jobs will be gone. How do we shift that narrative to bring people into this workplace now? And I'm just curious, it may not happen at the speed that I'd like it to happen, but how do we actually change it so we can get people into that workplace now? Ernie, go to you first. We'll go to Kevin, and Ryan, you'll take us out. Ernie,
Sure,
now I got only about 2 minutes. I'm just telling you that 2 minutes.
Sure. Yeah, no, sure. Like I mentioned earlier, working directly with community institutions in the community that know their population, that already have connections there, and like literally walking them into it. I think there has to be a lot of on the ground outreach, and that's what we're engaged in.
Love it. And as you've also opened up yourselves, people can reach out to you if they want more information. So thank you for that. And I assume they can go to your website. Kevin, what about you?
I hear a lot about how someone's not good enough, how we're not good enough. I want to say that we are good enough, we are enough, and we can get there just in spite of any of the challenges.
Right. Ryan, I'm not letting you pass this one up. I know we got just 30 seconds. As the human economist on the call, on the webinar, any final words on how we're going to get there to meet this supply constraint?
Be as holistic and inclusive as we're thinking about the social infrastructure barriers that constrain us as individuals, as an economy, as possible, and then be thoughtful about the solutions as a result of that moving forward.
You know what? Thank you everyone for participating. I cannot say enough how important this work is that you all spoke to, how many more questions that we actually have to solve, but more importantly, how sensitive we have to be to the fact that we've got to match some of these existing conditions, particularly those constraints that some of you in the workforce space actually experience today, like Kevin, to some of these important opportunities that actually are on the pathway forward. If we don't do that within this time, and that's why we recommend, and you're going to see it in our upcoming blog post, digital literacy is not just email and turning on a computer, folks. For those of you thinking about the BEAD money, it could be actually impacting some of these workforce programs to make a difference. Thank you to Beth, who started this conversation off. Thank you to Ernie, Kevin, Ryan. Thank you to all of you for joining us for this hour. Thank you to all your questions. Keep the conversation going on Twitter. I am Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee at the Brookings Institution, and I'm glad we were able to have you with us today. Thank you so much.